switch off my stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
One minute warning, everyone. We're going live in 1 minute. And we're going live. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the 9th presentation of Avalanche Canada's 2021-22 webinar series. My name is Brent Strand. I'm the producer for the evening. We got Alex Cooper in the background online there. He's going to be the moderator, looking out for your questions in the Q&A box. We hope you're all having a fantastic backcountry season this year. You know, we've been getting lots of snow. It's been pretty fantastic in the Revelstoke area. And we've all been getting at it here out of the office. You know, Avalanche Canada's mission is to help educate you backcountry users, because we want you to go out in the mountains. We want you to play safe. We want you to know more, go farther, and come home every day. First, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of the Four Nations, the Sinnix, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Silks. As a national organization, we also acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, Inuit nations whose lands we live and recreate on. First off, we'd like to thank our sponsors. Being a nonprofit organization, we really rely on our sponsorship. We have government partners that help us out, program partners that help with our AST programs, with our snowmobile programs and youth programs along the way. You know, it's those folks that have helped us through these challenging economic times and worked with us to reach new backcountry users such as yourself. You know, the big one, the webinar presentation today is sponsored by Skidoo and Polaris. Both of these companies have been supportive of Avalanche Canada over the years. They arrange loaner sleds for us and to help get our field teams and our forecasters out in the field, which is super critical for the work that we do. You know, supporting programs by donating, you know, we always appreciate donations. We are a nonprofit organization, so any little bit can help. We'd really appreciate that. Alex is going to drop some links in the chat box as we're going along today. He's going to drop a link to that in our chat box there, so you guys can go up there and donate anything to help us out. Couple housekeeping rules here. You guys are automatically muted. You don't have access to your webcam. If you want to ask a verbal question, we ask that you hit the little raise hand button and you can have that verbal interaction with our presenter. That's the best way. But for the most part, folks, if you got questions, put it in the Q&A box. Don't put it in the chat box. The chat box is used for links and resource links to web-based stuff. We really ask that you use that Q&A box. It's way easier for us to track those questions so we can get at all of them and get them off to the presenter. Another thing today, folks, the last few webinars we've been doing, we've been giving out some draw prizes at the end. So stick around to the end. We got some goodies here. We got some FXR toques. We got a BCA snow kit. Should be good. So stick around for that. Tonight's presentation, choosing terrain for snowmobilers. Terrain choice is always the answer to having a fun, safe day out in the backcountry. When the avalanche hazard is high or you're concerned about certain avalanche problems, you know, we want you to be able to recognize which terrain is good to go and which terrain is not so good. You know, you're in for a treat tonight. We got Avalanche Canada's lead North Rockies field technician, Martina Halick. She's going to lead us through a variety of images and some exercises. And she's also going to give us a breakdown, you know, a little back to the basics on the bulletin, forecast information that's out there that you can look at before you go out on your day. Martina is going to present various scenarios of the terrain combined with some danger ratings and stuff. And your questions are super awesome and welcomed at this point. You know, we want that good interaction and we want you to get the most out of this webinar. So don't be bashful, get those questions in as soon as you can when they seem pertinent while she's talking about that subject. With that being said, Martina Halick, she brings a wealth of experience to the backcountry. She's been working for Avalanche Canada since 2012, and she's currently the lead Avalanche field tech up in the North Rockies for the field team up there. Her favorite place to ride is the Renshaw, which led her to move to the small town of McBride, where she now calls home. So I'm going to pass it over to Martina now, and I hope you folks really enjoy the evening.
Thanks so much, Brent.
You're welcome.
Right. Let me get this going here. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Just gonna change a few things around on my screen here. For those of you, I hope there's some of you in the audience that maybe remember my presentation from last year on this topic. So I've changed it up a little bit. Some of it's going to be review, but I've put in some different exercises, made it a bit more interactive. So I'm hoping everybody, whether you're joining me for the first time or the second time, everybody gets something new from this. So this is always, you know, this is the point of this whole presentation right here, is you getting to the top of the mountain, or not the top of the mountain, but into your riding area. You know, you've got this gorgeous view. You've got all these different slopes, aspects, elevations, different types of things to ride. And you want to be at this point and know, you know, where your safe spots are. You want to know where the hazard is the greatest, where the riding is going to be the best, all those types of things. You don't want to get to this point and have no idea, be asking these questions. Like, is this safe to ride? Is it not? You want to have a pretty good sense before you even arrive of what to expect, and then maybe adjust throughout the day, depending on what you're seeing. So I'm going to give you guys some tips on how to do that, and hopefully everybody learned something today. So there we go. So it all starts, like Brent said right in the intro there, you know, with the Avalanche Triangle. So Avalanche Terrain is what we're going to focus on today on the presentation. But, you know, with any corner of this triangle, if you take it away, you don't have hazard, right? If we can ride an Avalanche Terrain all day, but if we don't have any unstable snow, if we don't have a weak layer, it's not going to be an issue, right? Similarly, we can play around on unstable snow all day, but if we're not in avalanche terrain, it's not steep enough to slide, then again, we're not going to have an issue. So really, this presentation is going to focus mostly on the avalanche terrain aspect. We're going to talk a little bit about different avalanche problems, but we're going to focus mostly on the terrain. So I'm going to do a quick review of the basics of avalanche terrain. So number one, I really can't push this one enough. I always like to know my slope angle. So I carry, I've got, this is my sort of dinky kind of looking slope meter, but you can use a compass, you can download free apps on your phone, and I kind of turn it into a bit of a game with me and my group, if we're hanging out and having lunch, I'll turn to my friend and be like, how steep do you think that slope over there is? And, ideally you get to the point where you can just look at a slope and whether it's avalanche terrain or not. But until you get there, it's great to pull out an inclinometer and actually confirm. So avalanches most often occur on slopes between 30 and 45 degrees. So that's your sweet spot. Anything less than 30, you can still get avalanches, but oftentimes, it takes pretty special conditions for an avalanche to occur on something that's less than 30. And above 45, it's generally just sloughing off, falling off, and you don't really get a slab building up. So that, it's not to say that you can't have, avalanche terrain or hazard, steeper or less steep than those, but that is where your kind of sweet spot is. So when I say that steepness, if you're if you're the person that is, why is that not working? Hang on. There we go. If you can just see the corner of a sled sticking out right here, you can be in the flats and still be in avalanche terrain. You can trigger avalanches from flat terrain, right? You can collapse a weak layer in the flats and it can travel uphill and trigger in the steep stuff and then come down onto you. So just because you're in the flats doesn't mean that you're not in avalanche terrain. So it's a really good idea to kind of have a good sense of what's around you, whether there's overhead hazard, because if there's a slope that's near you that could affect you, that's between 30 and 45 degrees, that's something to look out for and be aware of, because you're definitely in avalanche terrain at that point. The other super important thing is knowing your aspect and elevation bands. So when I say aspect, I mean which way is the slope facing? Is it facing north? Is it facing east? Having a compass or an app on your phone, having a general sense of the area, maybe even before you go, taking a look at it on a map or Google Earth or whatever your go-to method is. And then elevation band, Alpine, tree line, below tree line, all those sorts of things affect your avalanche problems and the snowpack. And you just kind of want to be aware of, or have a set plan at the beginning of the day of where you're going to ride. And just a quick note about terrain traps. These are anything that increase your hazard if you were to get caught. So when we look at this, I'm just going to switch to a laser pointer. When we look at this photo here, if this, even small piece of terrain here were to avalanche on this rider, he could be fully buried. He could be, squished between the slope and his sled. And so even a small size 1 avalanche that normally would not be a concern is a concern with a terrain trap, right? Similar with this, you could get funneled into this gully and it wouldn't take a lot of snow to bury you. You could get pushed up against trees, off of cliffs, all sorts of things to consider when you're about to get onto a slope or under a slope that is steep enough to slide. Quick review of the avalanche terrain exposure scale, otherwise known as the AITS rating. So we're going to start with complex terrain, and in this photo, we look at this and there's not a lot of potential here to avoid avalanche hazard if you have unstable snow, right? You're pretty much just in it. There's lots of terrain traps. We've got the cliffs here. It looks like there's some cliffs here, some trees. There might be some holes or gullies here that if you did get pushed into, you could be buried quite deeply. There's multiple start zones. I mean, basically everything you're looking at here could avalanche. Maybe not down here, but it could reach you, right? And there's really minimal options to exposure, to reduce your exposure. So if you're going to go into complex terrain, for me, I don't really venture into complex terrain unless the hazard is, I don't want to go there if it's elevated. And I really want to go there with a strong group. Even then, that with good decision-making skills, I want to have a good plan, because this is tiger country up here. Challenging terrain. So here we have exposure to well-defined avalanche paths. As you guys can see here, all these clear paths in between the trees are avalanche paths. Everything that's green here, I would consider challenging terrain. Everything that's above it is more complex terrain, these bigger start zones and stuff. So here we do have some options to reduce our exposure, if we were to make our way up these spines through the trees. But if you're anything like me, I'm not an expert rider, I'm a decent rider, but I would have a tough time, making my way up through these trees and playing in this area. So even though it's challenging terrain, a lot of riders would probably see this and want to go straight up the gut of it. So, when I say options to reduce your exposure, it also kind of depends on your riding ability and that sort of thing to consider. So you still would want some advanced skills to avoid the avalanche hazard if you're going to be getting into challenging terrain. Simple terrain. So here, basically everything that isn't colored in is simple terrain that you see. The yellow, I would call that challenging terrain, and the red is complex. So with simple terrain, you might have openings into avalanche runouts. So, this probably is a runout zone for this area. You've got some little zones in here that are maybe runouts of infrequent avalanches from above, that sort of thing. But really, we're looking at more lower angle, mostly forested terrain, that sort of thing. And I think it's always good to remember as riders, I don't know about you, but I can have a lot of fun in simple and even non-avalanche terrain. In the mountains, playing in the trees, in meadows, you can find, little hills, things to play on. So when we're kind of lucky that way, in a way that skiers aren't necessarily, in that, if it's not 30 degrees, then a skier doesn't really want to be on it, especially if there's a bunch of powder, right? Because you're not getting anywhere. But we can have a great time ripping around in powder in simple and non-avalanche terrain when the hazard is high. So it's something to keep in mind. So putting it all together, in this photo, we've got our yellow complex terrain, everything in here, not a lot of options to reduce your hazard. You're just in it. Most of these little pieces here, everything can produce an avalanche. When we get into, I'm just gonna switch back to my pointer, hang on. Sorry, in here. So in the complex terrain, not basically everything here is avalanche terrain. In the challenging stuff, you would have some options in the trees, but it's pretty steep. It'd be kind of tricky. Same over here. And then we've got our simple terrain that has the potential for run out from some of these other bigger pieces of terrain, but it's mostly lower angle. It's a little bit more manageable unless you have really extreme conditions. And then in front here, we've got our non-avalanche terrain. Are there any questions so far with any of this? I know I'm just throwing a lot at you guys, but if you have any questions, just type them into the Q&A, and Brent, you can just interrupt me for Alex. So when we put it all together, we're out there, we're on the slope, we're staring at it, and we want to know, is it safe to ride, right? So here's the questions that I always ask myself before I get onto a slope. So A, is it avalanche terrain? So when I look at this, I might want to get my inclinometer out, but I'm pretty sure looking up here at the top part of it, that this is 30 degrees, probably more than 30 degrees, could be 35 in spots. And, there's probably no trees here for a reason because it slides. I want to know what aspect it is. Which way does it face? Because that's going to definitely determine, depending on my avalanche problem, whether I'm going to get on it or not. What elevation band is it? Looks like it's at least tree line, could be in the Alpine. It's big open slope. And what are the potential consequences, right? So you know, if I trigger something here, could I get pulled into maybe a little bit of a gully feature here that would bury me more deeply? Could I hit some of these trees? What are the consequences if this does slide? What is the bulletin basically saying about the size of avalanche that I could even trigger that day? So does an avalanche problem exist here? And if we choose to ride it, how do we do it as safely as possible, right? So let's say I've read the bulletin, I've decided that yes, I want to get into it, but maybe I just want to get over this slope and to the other side, to better riding on the other side. In which case, I'm gonna switch to my pen again. I might, you know, if I want to do it as safely as possible, right up through these trees. This looks nice and open to get through for an intermediate rider, and get up to the top, right? And that way I've you know, not that this isn't avalanche terrain, but this is definitely bigger avalanche terrain in this area here, right? So I'm a lot safer on this path that I've drawn. And then let's say I do want to get on this bigger slope. I would potentially come in and drop into it from the top first and line myself up with a line where I'm not going to hit any trees. I'm not going to get pulled into maybe this little gully here, right? I want to have a nice open line to test out this slope. Now, I wouldn't want to really be testing a slope this big unless I was pretty darn sure that it was going to be safe to be on it. But if I were to go into it, you know, the most likely place that I would trigger an avalanche would be at the top right here, where it's the steepest, or at least it looks the steepest to me in this photo. So if I trigger an avalanche here, I have options. Maybe I can ride out to the side. Maybe I can pull my airbag. You know, there's some things that I can do, as opposed to if I came up from down here and decided to put in a high mark and then collapse the weak layer when I got to here and it traveled above me. Now I have all of this snow that's above me that's going to come down onto me and bury me. And at this point, it probably doesn't matter if I have an airbag or not, because that's tons and tons of snow that are going to come down. So when you're looking at a slope, all these sorts of questions kind of come to mind, from super basic to more complex. But we're going to start with the bulletin because that's where we get our info. So the bulletin has 3 different layers. We start from the pretty basic to digging in more and more in-depth and complex. So the first page that you come to is basically providing you with the danger ratings, a headline, and some travel and terrain advice. And I feel like a lot of people that I meet in the backcountry, if I ask them if they know what the hazard is or if they've read the bulletin, most can remember the color, or, you know, that it was maybe considerable or that it was low. But, you know, what is considerable? What does orange really tell us? It doesn't tell us where the hazard is. It does tell us that there's dangerous avalanche conditions and there's careful snowpack evaluation and cautious route finding necessary. And, you know, high, it kind of tells us that, you know, travel in avalanche terrain is not really recommended at all. But when you get to, you know, for most people, it's like, what does orange mean? I think it means different things to different people. And if we really want to delve into how the bulletin can help us, we need to move on to the second page, which is our avalanche problems and our character. So this gives us the nature of the hazard, the details of where and when, the likelihood and size of the avalanches. And this is the info we really use to help select our terrain.
Hey, Martina.
So, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but did you want to pop that poll up and just see how much of the bulletin folks actually do read? I'm kind of curious.
That was in 2 slides.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm just jumping the gun. My apologies, Ellen.
Yeah, I'm going to get there in 2 slides, but it won't be long, I promise. So when we look at an avalanche problem here, we get the details on where we expect to see it, right? Alpine tree line or below tree line. Here it's saying it's on all slopes, but sometimes it's just limited to a specific slope. Like we can see over here, you know, it's just on west and southwest aspects. And the likelihood of triggering, you know, how certain is it that we're gonna trigger something, or it's gonna maybe go naturally. And then the expected size. So from a size 1 being something that's not, you know, going to necessarily, you know, it's not big enough to bury you unless you get pushed into a train trap, all the way up to a size 3. So a size 2 would be 10 size 1s, 10 size 2s would be a size 3, and so on. So, you know, size 3s aren't very survivable, and not that many size 2s are either. So it's definitely something to consider. And then the third tab, we're not going to really delve into this at all during this presentation, but this is great to read as well. We get our avalanche summary, snowpack summary, and weather forecast. So now we're ready for our poll, because I'm curious, how do you guys use the bulletin? Do you read the first page with the danger ratings and the headline and the travel advice, or do you read the first and second page, all 3 pages, or maybe you just generally don't read the bulletin? And I'm going to say, go ahead and pick the one that's most common for you. Like if you've once read through the whole bulletin, but that's not your norm, then don't select that one, you know. Yeah, just pick the one that is your norm. And I'm not seeing stuff pop up here. Maybe Brent, you can see, but I'm not seeing our votes coming in. Oh, there we go. Awesome. So I think everybody can, I'm hoping everybody can see that. So about 6% of you have said that you read the first page with the danger ratings and headline. 26% say that you read the first and second pages. 62% read all 3 pages. That's a lot more than I was actually expecting, because most of the people that I meet in the backcountry don't read all 3. So that's impressive. And then 6% of you don't generally read the bulletin at all. So hopefully, yeah, all of you get something out of this presentation. And yeah.
Martina, I'm not sure. We do have a hand up from the floor. They may have a question here. Tyler, Rochelle. Curious if you had a question, or you may have just impromptu put your hand up. I know that does happen. So you just have to unmute yourself if you do have a question. And it looks like he's removed his hand. So
okay.
Moving on. Thanks.
Sounds good. Okay. So next, that's kind of, I mean, if you guys do have any questions, feel free to you know, type them in there, because we're kind of done that whole part that was probably review for some of you about you know, terrain and the bulletin and that sort of stuff, and we're going to get into the exercises. So each scenario is going to include, you know, our danger ratings of problems and a terrain photo, and we're just going to kind of work through those. So the first problem, I feel like I see this problem a lot, quite frequently, and I feel like every bulletin gets this, you know, where we get moderate, low, and just the one avalanche problem. Generally, our winds in BC and Alberta are coming from the south or the west and loading the northeast aspects. And I feel like quite often people see this and they're like, oh, well, if it's not orange or red, it's green, you know. But we do have an avalanche problem, but it's I feel like it's a very manageable one, because it only exists on specific or isolated aspects, and it's still good to be aware of and manage. So let's say this is our piece of terrain where we've chosen to ride this day, and right off the bat, I'm just gonna go to my laser pointer. When I see snow like this in the foreground, that's a great indicator for me that there is wind slab and that it does exist. Because this snow is created, this texture is created by the wind. You can tell that it's not just your normal flat powder. You can see there's chunks, a few chunks flying off the snowmobile here. It's a bit stiffer. So seeing snow like this isn't necessarily an indicator that there is hazard, or that, you know, that wind slab is unstable. But if our wind slab has been forecast in the bulletin, and then you see that the snow looks like that, it's like one more clue, right? So based on this, you know, when we apply this, We know that our hazard is in treeline and Alpine, and that it's everywhere but northwest through southwest aspects, right? So when I look at this, you know, the places that I've circled there, it's not necessarily that that would be out for the whole day, but if I have all of this other terrain to ride, you know, this is where I've figured out that the hazard is the greatest, right? All the winds have come, I don't know if you guys can tell with this compass, but basically these are our northeast aspects, the way that it's pointing. So all of our wind has come from here and deposited on these slopes, right? It's built up these cornices in here. And so this is where the highest hazard is. So even though it's only possible to trigger, you can trigger a size 2.5 avalanche. Anything that's size 2 or bigger is enough to injure or kill you. So, you know, unless I was like nuanced enough to go in there and dig a pit and really poke around, it might just be easier to ride other areas, right? Just stay off the terrain that's north, you know, through south facing there. That being said, if we went around the corner and there was a mirrored piece of terrain, but it was now west facing, you know, then there's no hazard there, right? Not to say no hazard, but it's not where it's forecast, right? So I would feel much more comfortable riding this terrain if it was west facing and didn't have the avalanche problem on it. So same slope or same problem, different slope, right? You're standing up here thinking, should we drop in? This looks pretty fun to ride, right? We know based on this compass over here, this is a west facing slope. So looking at it, yeah, you know, this would be pretty good to drop into, all this stuff down here. We've got this little piece of terrain here that there's pieces of it that are kind of more north facing and could be, you know, cross-loaded by the wind. If the wind came from the south or you know, it came in around here, there could be little wind slabs. So I probably wouldn't jump into this purple terrain until I, you know, investigated a bit more. And then this stuff in the back that's yellow is all north facing. So that's exactly where our problem is. And so I would be much more leery getting into that and probably just avoid it for the day unless I could confirm it, especially when there's all this other good riding to be had. So it's like easy to avoid, right? So that brings us to our second poll. Same hazard, same problem. Which side do you guys feel is safer to ride on this day? Would you ride the sunny side or the shady side? And I'll let Brent pull that one up. Perfect. And if you don't know, just guess. Do the one that feels right. But I'm hoping that you guys will have the right intuition with this one. I mean, I'd be tempted to just stay in the sun because it's sunny personally. It looks so nice, even though they're like snowboarding in that one, not riding it, but it looks like good sled terrain too. I mean, both sides look super tempting. Awesome. So 69% of you said you would pick the sunny west facing slope, and 31 said the shaded east facing slope. All right. So looking at that, let me just click here. So those of you that said this sunny side, you are more right than the people that said the east facing side. So this slope is facing west, right? So it's not which way is west. And that can be a mistake that's easy to make, right? So because it says east here, it's tempting to think that, you know, this is the east slope, but it's actually west facing. So your west side is the part that doesn't have that problem today. So there's no avalanche problem forecast. So all of this stuff would be probably pretty good to ride this day, you know, up into the stuff across the valley here, because we don't even have a problem below tree line. So all of that stuff is good to go. Now, this purple stuff is east facing, but the bottom of it, I mean, your wind slabs are probably going to be up high here, right? When we look at this, wind slabs have been more, that's not really giving us a ton of clues, but really the wind slabs tend to form from up high right over top of ridge crest, that sort of thing. So I would probably avoid this stuff. I mean, it looks pretty gnarly to ride anyway, but the stuff down here, I would maybe start to poke into, considering that it is just moderate hazard. It's not considerable or high, but I would definitely, play around on the west facing stuff and below tree line first if it was good riding there. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Does anyone that voted for the other side have any questions about why? And remember, there's like no dumb questions or anything. Like, this is for you guys. So just pop in there, if you have any questions. Okay, so moving on to problem 2. So each problem, we're just going to kind of make it a little bit more complex. So we've got a deep persistent slab problem. It's in the Alpine and tree line. And this time it's on all aspects in the Alpine and tree line. So below tree line, still good. And the chance of avalanches is possible. So it's not really that likely, but the consequences are really high, right? Like, you're going to trigger at least a size 2 up to a size 4, it looks like. So it's not it's not a good one to trigger. And our hazard in the Alpine is high. So when we apply that to this lovely piece of terrain here, I would start thinking right away, I'm going to want to avoid the Alpine, right? It's just easy. It's not recommended to go up there unless you know for sure there's some area in there that's non-avalanche terrain. You might just be threading the needle, but it's probably easiest to just stay out of the Alpine unless you're really, really sure. This yellow stuff is tree line, right? Again, our hazard is considerable. We might be getting really large avalanches coming out of the Alpine and spilling into tree line. So I would maybe poke into the tree line if there were some areas of really simple terrain or non-avalanche terrain that I could get into. But all this other stuff, even if there's some slopes down here that are 30 degrees, everything that's below tree line doesn't have this deep persistent slab, right? So the other thing to look out for, it recommends here, if it does warm up, solar radiation, so the sun comes out, if there's cornices above it, even triggering a smaller avalanche might, overload the snowpack, trigger a bigger one. So I would, on a day like this, really be sticking below tree line or in non-avalanche terrain if I was going to go up higher. If that makes sense. So same problem, different piece of terrain. Some of you might recognize this as Renshaw, my favorite. So similar idea here, right? We've got all this area that's mostly below tree line or super low angle. We've got, let me just do this. Oops, lose it. We've got this area here, some little maybe pieces of tree line, right? But overall, so that, hazard could be considerable there. But again, you're kind of trying to thread the needle, push into it. You want to be pretty certain if you're going to be going up into those areas. So the other thing might be, like, it's hard to tell from a photo, or if you're standing here from far away, maybe this area that's in the Alpine, like, maybe this is all 10 or 15 degrees in steepness, and this is fine to ride if there's no overhead hazard, right? But you won't really know unless you maybe get a bit closer and then check with your inclinometer. But if you don't want to have a complex day, you don't want to risk, you don't want to be threading the needle, there's all this other terrain that's good to play in, right? Areas that I would really stay out of are big steep areas like this. This looks pretty steep here. This stuff in the background, all of that I would just not even go into on a day like this. Okay, scenario 3. So different problem. We have a wet loose problem. It's considerable, moderate. And I'm just gonna throw it right over to our piece of terrain here. So here, you know, our problem advice here is that the spring sun combined with rising freezing levels can pack a punch quickly, initiating loose wet avalanches. And then it tells you to, you know, watch for these signs of instability and stuff. So really our safest areas are on Shady, northwest through northeast slopes. And it's everywhere again, Alpine tree line and below tree line. And our chance of triggering is quite likely smaller avalanches, but when we put it on this piece of terrain, I'm gonna leave it to you guys again. If you had to pick a side, which side do you feel is safer to ride on this day? And I'll let you guys think about that. We've got some cool colors going on there with rainbow and silver. But yeah, so just think about it based on that avalanche problem and that hazard rating, what would you do? I got really excited about the sparkle pen, so I went a little crazy. You guys are just gonna have to put up with it. All right. And the votes are in. So 29% of you said the sunny rainbow side would be safer, and 71% said that the shaded silver side would be the safest. So I'm going to agree with the 71%. And I realize I didn't give you guys a compass here, so it was kind of a tricky question in that. I'm not sure if the previous one had a compass. Let me check. No, it didn't. So this was kind of tricky to see if you guys could figure it out, but because the avalanche problem said that it was being caused by the sun and freezing levels, you know, this is a pretty big hint that this is north facing, and that this, because it's got sun on it, is your south facing side. So your problem is really confined to all those west through south through east aspects where the sun is going to be hitting them and where the warming temperatures are really going to have an effect. Whereas your shady north facing slopes are not going to have that problem on it, right? Now, I would, as an extra note of caution, there's this kind of like laneway in the middle here. And there is a potential, you know, at the bottom here that you could have natural wet loose avalanches that could come down and hit you. I mean, you wouldn't be the one triggering them, but they could happen. So, you know, if you're just going to scoot through really quick, you'd probably be okay, like this guy, but I wouldn't be like setting up to have lunch here, you know, or I'd really try and avoid getting my sled stuck here. This isn't the place that I would be practicing, you know, something more complex on my sled. Whereas higher up on the slope, staying in the shade is where you're going to be the safest. And this is your forecast for the day. And I guess I should clarify with these things. When I'm saying a safer side to ride, I'm not putting in rider ability. Like, I do realize that there's cliffs up here and that it's maybe trickier to ride, but I was kind of thinking, you know, if you could ride anything, you're a pro for a day. This would be your safer side. Okay, so same problem, different terrain.
Martina, sorry, it's Alex here, just chiming in with a question from Shane regarding that last slide you were on. So maybe just want to go back. And he just wanted to know the shaded section and just confirm that it's north-facing terrain.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Shane. So I do realize I tricked you guys because I didn't put a compass into this one at the beginning because I just wanted to see if you guys could kind of figure that out. So north-facing slopes don't really get any sun, especially in the winter. Whereas, you know, everything, you know, east-facing slopes will get sun in the morning, south kind of during the afternoon, and then west in the late afternoon. So all of the west, east through west faces will get sun, and that's why there is a wet loose problem on those slopes. So yeah, the shady side is the north facing side. And so, I mean, even if you were just riding here and you knew that this was the problem for the day, wet loose, and you didn't know if one was, which aspect either one was, and you didn't have a compass, the fact that this area is in the shade and you know that the bulletin said that this problem was going to be triggered by the sun, then you'd have a pretty good sense that this would be safer to ride than the sunny side, because this is currently getting the sun, and so the problem is highest on this side right now. Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, keep them coming.
Okay. Yeah, that's all the questions we have for now, unless yeah, I see for now, so keep on going.
Cool. Okay. So same problem, different terrain. So we've got big complex terrain here. We look at the shady side, you know, all this stuff. I mean, I realize there's some sunny bits, but for the most part, you know, there's lots of shady stuff here. All of this is, let's call it north facing. And then we want to stay off of the sunny stuff. And then here we've got mostly north facing terrain again, right? So that's how we would handle that. But what if we add another avalanche problem to this? Because we're not often lucky enough to just have the one avalanche problem. Sometimes there's 2, even 3 different problems that we're dealing with. So if we had a cornice problem, now we see that this, it's on different aspects. So now we don't have really a safe aspect to be on in the Alpine, right? So we go from having a few safe spots to now not having very many at all, right? I'm just gonna switch back to my pen. You know, when I say I'm questioning this, I don't know if there's cornices here, right? There might be. I'd probably need some binoculars or to get a bit closer if I you know, felt like I could risk that. But we have all of these cornices up here that are a new problem, everything along here. So even though they were safer with just the wet loose problem, now we want to avoid anything that has overhead hazard from these cornices. So now we're really kind of threading the needle, and there isn't much that's safe. Like maybe this stuff is safe, but maybe this area here has a cornice, and so that takes out that. Maybe there's a cornice up here. And so now there's, you know, there's not that many places to ride. I might just pick a different area to ride on this day, rather than be, you know, constantly looking above me to see if something's going to drop on me and trigger a bigger avalanche. Okay, problem 4. So it's getting more complex here, but what I've done here with the persistent slab and the wind slab is they're quite similar in that they're all on the same aspects, and they're both in tree line and Alpine. Now the potential consequences are quite high, so that's something to consider with the persistent slab and going into the Alpine. But let's say, you know, this is your day out here. This is where you really want to go, and you just really, really want to get into the Alpine on this day, right? So I'm gonna let you guys take a moment here to really look at these avalanche problems. I'm not even gonna make you memorize a text or anything like that, but take a look at where they are, where the hazard is the greatest, okay? Everybody's got that. And now we're gonna do our last poll, and I'm gonna challenge you guys to pick the safest line to reach the Alpine, because for sure it would be safest to just stay below tree line on this day because there's no hazard there, but we're not gonna make it that easy. Let's say you're just really determined to go to the Alpine. So how do you stay as safe as possible while getting into the Alpine on this day? So which line do you pick? I managed to not to stay away from the rainbow pen this time, but figured some of you would maybe pick that just because it's rainbow. I probably would. So hopefully you guys remembered where the avalanche problem was, because when you get out there into the terrain, unless you have actually printed out the bulletin or maybe saved it on your phone, you know, all those details, you're trying to remember, okay, which aspects were they? And was there a problem at tree line? And how big was the expected size? All that sort of stuff. A lot of times, all you can just remember is, oh, it was considerable, or, you know, some part of it. So this is where you actually apply it to the terrain. And so remember, oh, I think you guys are done. Okay, perfect. So 14% said orange, 62% said green, 5% said red, and 19% said silver. Okay. So I'm going to go by them one by one. So starting with orange here. So you're pretty well off to begin with, right? So you're starting out up here. This is pretty simple terrain, right? And this is a south facing slope, right? South is that way. So all of this stuff is facing south. Then we drop down into here. We're still pretty good because we're on this low angle ridge. And then we get into this area. And I can't really tell. This could be less than 30 degrees. I'd probably be pulling out my inclinometer here because I'm not sure, you know, about this spot right here, because now this is a bit west facing, right? So we do have some problems, you know, it's in the Alpine, so it is considerable in the Alpine on west facing slopes. But let's say this isn't, you know, avalanche terrain. There's no overhead hazard. Maybe it's only 20 degrees. So we're good to go. We come up to here. This is definitely avalanche terrain. This is definitely steep enough to slide, but we're back to south facing. So we're good again. Then this stuff is pretty low angle, but then we get up into here. And this is a giant piece of complex avalanche terrain. And this is west facing, possibly even northwest facing. It's hard to tell with my janky compass. But this is the part that I would be most worried about. You know, if you'd stopped here, yeah, that would be okay. But if this was your goal to play around, maybe put in some high marks here, that would not be the safest option. Okay, so then we have our green line coming up here, pretty much a non-avalanche terrain, go up through here, through some simple, maybe challenging terrain. It's all south facing, so we're good to go. We get up into the ridge line here. This is still probably pretty low angle. We get up to here. This is getting into complex, steep terrain, but it's still south facing. So those of you that said the green line, you are correct. Okay, based on that forecast, this would be the safest line into the Alpine. But I'm going to talk about the other ones as well. So for those of you that pick the red line, you know, you start off good. You're going through some almost non-avalanche terrain, some simple terrain, into these trees. Then you're getting into some pretty, I don't know, I'd even say there's a little bit of complex terrain here. And then you're getting into really complex terrain up here. So this is a big west facing slope. And basically, when we look back at this, at our avalanche problems, our safe areas are southwest through southeast, right? So this area, you know, parts of it, this area might even be kind of northwest facing. This would definitely not be my choice for the day. That seems to be one of the areas that you would be where the avalanche problem is the most likely. So the silver line here, again, starts out good, goes through these trees, goes up this avalanche path, but you could argue that's below tree line and our problems don't really exist there. Cuts across here, this might be relatively low angle. And you know, if you'd taken, I'm gonna move this, if you had taken the line through here, then you would have been good. But if you just deke out a little bit, you know, it doesn't take much to get into the hazardous area over on the side here. And again, you're on this big, complex, west-facing slope, which is exactly where the problem is the greatest. Once you get up into here, again, you're south-facing, you're fine. But, you know, just cutting off into this stuff here is what up the hazard there. So hopefully that makes sense to anyone. Did anyone vote for a different colored line and I didn't explain it well enough? That might be the case. Let me know. Hopefully all of that makes sense. And I should add a caveat to the bulletin that I didn't before. I mean, sometimes things aren't necessarily exactly as forecast. So it's not like if you took this green line, there's no hazard just because the bulletin said that there wouldn't be. You're still in big complex terrain, but this is your best case for that day. If you're going up into big complex terrain, you have a pretty good idea based on the bulletin that your hazard isn't going to be there. And then it's up to you to verify whether that's the case. And if there's other signs of instability that aren't lining up to that, right? So we're keeping it pretty simple, but you got to remember that we're people that are forecasting for huge regions, 40,000 square kilometers, let's say, and the snowpack is going to vary across that terrain. So really these forecasts are just your best bet at what the safest terrain is. So you still, even if you are going up on this green line, I'd make those choices of, what's the safest way I can do this? How can I avoid terrain traps? How can I keep it lower angle, maybe hit some test slopes first, all that sort of stuff. Okay, last scenario. I just want to run through this one really quick. This happens in the spring. So this is after the forecasts end in, I believe, the end of April. And, lots of us still get out, there's still, might not be much powder left unless you're really far north, but, it's still nice to get out, the sun's out. It's a good time to high mark because you can go anywhere. Oftentimes the hazard can be lower, but I just wanted to talk through a scenario where you go out and this is your bulletin and you don't have specific problems. So really taking this little piece of advice to heart. So the danger is really variable and it can go from low to high, and it can be really dynamic throughout that day because the sun and the warming has a big punch. So similar to when we had that wet loose problem, as soon as the sun gets on something, the hazard starts to go up, especially the longer that it's on that slope. So traveling early in the day can be good. I mean, stuff might be kind of bulletproof, but it's a great time to get out because your hazard it can be almost nothing. And then, 3 hours later when the sun hits it, now it's shooting through the roof. So when I look at this piece of terrain here, again, I have a weak spot for Renshaw. Areas like this, areas like this slope in the foreground, I might try ride that early in the day. But if it was a bluebird day like this, the sun's beating on it, I would probably start to move off it into those shady slopes as soon as I notice the snow becoming moist or something like that. And, if there was a big dump of snow, like you can see the snow is pretty powdery, the track is digging in pretty deep, maybe there's a storm slab problem, right? So you kind of have to be your own forecaster on these days and dig in a little bit deeper, but the clues are still there, especially if it's just, hasn't snowed for a long time and it's really just a case of what is the sun hitting, what's shady and what's not. So hopefully that helps explain that one. So thank you, you guys. I'm like basically right on time here, but I mean, ask some questions, like for sure. I mean, I don't think I explained it all so well that there would be no questions. So feel free to throw them at me. They don't even have to be about the presentation. They can be about some other, avalanche writing, whatever related topics. So feel free to throw them at me. Otherwise, I will hand it off to you, Alex.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions. So give people maybe another few seconds to ask something. And then if we don't, we can move on to the end and give out some prizes.
They just want the prizes. Enough of me talking at them.
No, thanks, Martina. One, Andrew McChin, is there an app that you recommend for inclines?
For inclines, I think it depends on the phone. For measuring, I would just honestly look at the App Store and just put in, I don't personally use my phone for it. I use an inclinometer or a compass because I have one, have that with me. But I know there's tons of different free ones out there to use. The other thing that you can do if you want to get a good idea before you head into an area of how steep stuff is to check out caltopo.com, and you can put on slope shading as a layer over your map of your riding area, and it will tell you, it'll be different colors for different steepnesses. So that's a great way to kind of know ahead of time. It's not good if you're just wanting to check one tiny slope, but if you want to check, you know, the mountain or the riding area to find out if it's going to be complex or challenging or that sort of thing, that's a great way to check that out. There's also, you know, just Avalanche Canada has those avalanche terrain exposure scale ratings. So you can always check that out and just see if the area, you know, is complex. Chances are, I mean, that's all going to be avalanche terrain. So yeah, as for a specific app, I can't really recommend one, but I know there's just tons of them out there, and I think all of them work. So yeah, find a free one. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I see a question just popped in from Kirsten Berg. She asks if you could mention something about how the avalanche problem can determine your riding risk. Like, are you more conservative when there's a persistent slab problem?
Yes, definitely. So when there's a persistent problem, a lot of times, and this will be reflected in the hazard and often in the details underneath that problem, like what's written there, and you know, even reading further into maybe the headline too. The problem with persistent weak layers is that they can be scary in that you can trigger them from the flats. I've triggered avalanches a kilometer away from a flat spot in a meadow, and it's just collapsed the entire way through meadows and up the mountain. So that's pretty terrifying when, you know, if it's high hazard and it's a persistent problem. I personally find that scarier than high hazard because of a loose wet problem or something like that. So persistent and deep persistent slabs, for me especially, are just require a lot of extra caution, and those are the days where I won't be trying to thread the needle through complex terrain at all, as opposed to wind slabs, cornices, maybe even storm slabs can be a bit easier to manage. But again, you want to be kind of at that AST2 level or maybe even higher. You want to have a really strong group if you're going to be pushing into, you know, if you're really going to be deciding on the risk based on the problem, you want to have a lot more information. You'd be reading into the details page. You'd want to be familiar with that area and that sort of thing. But to answer your question, like, yes, I definitely worry more about persistent problems than the rest. So, yeah.
Thanks, Martina. We've got another question from Charlie asking about how can we weigh the risk between triggering an avalanche on our sled to being on our snowboards?
Well, great question. I was just reading an article about this the other day. I want to just like grab it and read it out loud because it was so much more eloquent than what I'm going to say. I feel like the risk, so when you're on your sled, you have more options to avoid avalanche terrain or be in mellower terrain, right? As opposed to on your snowboard, especially if it's a powder day, like you're gonna need some momentum to get going. So, you know, if you do have a really widespread problem and you just, you know, it's safest to stick below tree line and really mellow terrain, you might be able to manage that risk better on your sled because you can just avoid avalanche terrain or have fun and really mellow stuff. That being said, I don't know, personally, if you gave me a choice and I was gonna trigger an avalanche, I would just feel safer on my skis or snowboard because I feel like there's more chance to maybe ride out of it or grab onto a tree. Whereas on my sled, now I'm getting rolled in an avalanche with this giant heavy machine that has the ability to crush and injure me and basically kill me. So there's all sorts of different risks and things to consider. I also feel like on skis or on a snowboard, if I was right at the top of the avalanche and had triggered it, I would have a better ability to cut out to the side. On my sled, like I don't think I could side hill out of a moving slab. Like it's hard enough to balance and and side hill on something that's 30 degrees without it moving, you know. So I feel like, yeah, there's kind of benefits and disadvantages to both, and they're very different. I feel like sledding and snowboarding are they're such different sports, and the way that you use terrain is so different. The only thing they have in common is sometimes they share the same terrain. So you kind of have to learn the drawbacks and benefits of each, and manage that depending on your day. So yeah, there's hopefully that answers your question. If not, then I can expand upon that, but yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks, Martina. No, I think that was a great answer, and went into a lot of different things to consider between the two sports. We have another question from Eric P, and he's asking, and then I know this is a question that's sort of been talked about a bit in this snowmobiling world in the last couple of years, but if you know an area or slope is ridden a lot, would you have more confidence in it during a general slab problem than a more remote slab? So I think it's talking really about, like, you know, how slopes might be compacted by sledder traffic versus, you know, areas that don't see as much.
Yes, that's a great question. You know, especially when you go to areas that are really, really popular. You know, Allen Creek comes to mind, and I don't know if you know, everyone's familiar with that area, but I've gone there, and it literally looks like a groomed ski hill. Like, there's so many tracks everywhere. So with areas like that, if you know, it's an area that you ride a bunch, and you were there the day before, and it was totally tracked, you know, from one end to the other, depending on the type of problem that you have, I feel like you're far less likely to trigger something on that slope than you would be on an untouched slope if you're in an area that doesn't get much traffic. But you have to be careful with that one, because even with persistent weak layers, like, let's say, a surface core problem, you know, there's been places where that surface core can regrow over tracks. So it might have been tracked a bunch, and then, you know, it was left overnight, a bunch of surface core grew on it, and it could still slide. So it's not like there's no hazard on those compacted areas, but if there's, you know, 100 tracks on a slope, I'm going to feel pretty good about that slope, especially if I'm in amongst the track. It's not, you know, I'm putting in the highest high mark of the 20 other high marks that are there, right? So when we talk about compaction, it's like a lot of compaction, but even ski hills have avalanches that happen inbound. So, you know, it's still good to consider that you're in avalanche terrain, and certain problems aren't going to be, you're correct, certain slab problems aren't going to be as much of a problem in compacted areas as other areas, but they're still good to consider, and you want to be certain. And you know, I can give you an example too. I'm going to go on a tangent, but sometimes we get really used to areas having a bunch of compaction, and we get that familiarity with that terrain. And I almost got caught this season. I went up to Renshaw, of course, and it was one of the first days of the season. It wasn't even groomed to go up there. And there was a slope that I went up that normally has 100 tracks on it, and I just don't even really think about it most of the time, right? And I went straight up it, and I hadn't even dug a pit. There was no bulletin, because I'm the bulletin, right? I'm supposed to be gathering information for the bulletin. And without a second thought, I go up there, and it's super deep, and now I'm stuck in like the steepest part of this big convex rollover. And I'm about to call my coworker to come up and give me a hand, when I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I just went straight into a slope without doing any kind of assessment, because I felt so familiar with it. There's no previous tracks here. And now I'm stuck in the steepest slope, and I'm about to call the only person that could rescue me to come get me. So, you know, I would just be cautious around that, because it can get all of us, you know, like it almost got me, and I got lucky. You know, the snow was unstable, but I got lucky and I didn't trigger anything. But it was kind of a wake up call. So yeah, anyway, that's my tangent on that, I guess. Hopefully that answers your question.
Well, thanks a lot, Martina. That's all the last question we have here. So unless something pops up soon, I think we can just move on, give out some prizes.
Yeah, awesome.
Thanks a ton, Martina. That was like incredibly comprehensive and a fantastic reminder for folks to look and understand the terrain they're getting into. And look at those avalanche problems, you know, like that's the good piece of the bulletin that allows you to pick, you know, where those problems are going to be and how you can manage your terrain around them. Sure. And I was actually quite surprised. I think so many people just look at the colors, and we had what, 62% read all 3 pages. So we got some you know, snow nerds, detail folks out there, which is great to see, because man, that's awesome information that you can get prior to leaving the house. You know, you can get a heads up before you're even out there and get caught with your pants down, because we don't want that out there. And as far as avalanche problems, Simon Horton, he's one of our other forecasters. He did a talk there about avalanche problems earlier in the season. And all our other previous webinars, you know, they're all available. They're all recorded, so you guys can check all that stuff out. I really want to thank Martina tonight. Thanks a lot. Thanks for all your information. And thank everyone else for hanging out here. We're going to move on to Alex. He's going to pick some names, and we're going to draw. We got some FXR toques. We got comes with a little fat map neck buff. And then as well, our 4th prize is going to be a BCA snow study kit. So let's take it away, Alex.
All right, thanks a lot, Brent. So the first prize, the toque and the fat map, goes to Josiane Lorty. I apologize for mispronouncing that if I did. So congratulations, Josiane. If you hear your name called, please email producer@avalanche.ca to claim your prize. All right, and then the next one, the next FXR toque and fat map subscription goes to, and I just need to make sure they stuck around for the whole thing before I give it out. Sorry about this. Goes to Rick Solinsky. So congratulations, Rick. You've won an FXR toque and a fat map subscription. To claim that, please email producer@avalanche.ca. And then the third prize, the third toque and fat map subscription, goes to Andrew Campbell. So congratulations, Andrew. And as mentioned, producer@avalanche.ca. So thanks so much to FXR and Fat Map for those 3 prizes. We've got one more though, as Brent mentioned, the BCA Snow Study Kit. And this great prize, it contains a lot of awesome, interesting tools, including an inclinometer, which is one of the most helpful tools out there in the backcountry. And this one goes to Shane Sear. So congratulations, Shane. I saw Shane asking good questions in there as well. So glad you got that one. Yeah, so once again, to Josiane, Rick, Andrew, and Shane, please email producer@avalanche.ca to claim your prize. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Congratulations, everybody. Thank you all for your interest tonight. You know, we super appreciate you folks coming out, hanging out with us for the evening. Tell your friends, we still got more coming up this year. We really want to thank folks, you know, as a nonprofit organization. I'm just going to reach out again here. We appreciate your interest in avalanche safety, and we're always up for any kind of donation. You know, $5, $10, whatever you want to dig out of your pocket. We really appreciate that. Our next webinar next week, February 10th. It's a conditions update on Vancouver Island. I know we usually get a lot of folks from out in Vancouver area and stuff. If you're out on the island, this is going to be a good one. They're going to talk about the conditions. We're going to have our field team members on there chatting about that. Pre-registration is required. You can find it on our website. Go there, check that out. And thanks a lot, folks. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your winter. It looks like we're getting a little more snow now, maybe a little sunshine on the weekend to go enjoy it. But yeah, hopefully it keeps giving it to us. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks, Martina and Alex. And have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night.